Just like Jack.
I wrote a musical.
Huh? You wrote a musical?
Why did you do that?
Just to write a musical. What? Does there have to be a reason? I don't think so.
Yeah, there does. Nobody writes a musical for no reason. It doesn't make sense.
All right, well, this guy did, so there you go.
They're calling it the biggest fumble in cinematic history. They're calling it the lowest cinema score for a comic book movie, because it is. They're calling it so bad, it only got an 11-minute standing ovation at Cannes. Absolute trash. Worthless shit. I could get that for filming myself making hummus. Secret is adding too much to meaning. They're calling it a subversive masterpiece. Welcome back to the year 2020. Let's argue if Joker is good or not. I'm gonna be honest, the process of making this video kind of made me become the Joker. For reasons that have nothing to do with events outside of the film itself. I don't even care that there's a crease on the green screen. I'll figure it out in the edit. I'm losing it. I find myself being weirdly defensive of Joker 2, despite the fact that when I actually watched the film myself, I was pretty disappointed by it. I fully admit part of that is just me having a petty grudge against the people who've used this movie's massive failure as an excuse to endlessly remind everyone they already thought the first movie was bad. You're also familiar with the work of obscure cult director Martin Scorsese? That's cool, man. But the fact is, there's a lot of people like myself who, if anything, probably liked the first Joker a little too much, then watched this one and did not feel they got what they really wanted out of it. And this is complicated by the fact that in part it's very deliberate that Joker 2 is not giving people what they want.
Because I got the sneaking suspicion that we're not giving the people what they want.
The film is commenting on the relationship between the Joker and his fans, and I think there's a lot of poignancy in what it has to say. On the other hand, dismissing criticism of the film because it sabotaged itself on purpose starts to reek of you just don't like it because you lack media literacy, which I've already yapped about a lot in the past. Essentially, I feel trapped in alienating almost any group that has any opinion on Joker by making this video. I'm unable to be the bandwagon guy or the contrarian guy, and those are the only two things you can be on this website. So I've ended up with this. Deadpool is a lot like Joker when you think about oh god. I feel the need to get you up to speed with the movie Joker 2, which statistically speaking, you did not watch. I will not be using the subtitle Folie à Deux in this video, because France isn't real. Wait, no! So the first Joker movie was a loose adaptation of the Alan Moore graphic novel The Killing Joke, the only comic book about the Joker ever made. Mostly it borrows from its heavily implied definitive origin of the character, depicting him as a down-on-his-luck stand-up comedian who falls into a life of crime in a last-ditch effort to make ends meet. I think a lot of newer fans enjoy this origin plot as a kind of lore Easter egg. They watch the Heath Ledger version of the character with like 5 different contradictory backstories and then get to go, hey guys, I know what really happened. End of the day, the Joker is a work of fiction and can have as many different origins as he has different authors. And even the original comic paints doubt on if this is the real story behind the character.
None of this is real. It may be alarming to people, but none of it is real.
That isn't what makes it so significant. What it does is take an outlandish pop culture relic who was already like 50 years old at the time and grounds him plausibly in a material reality. I think it's notable that the more fantastical part of his origin, escaping Batman by jumping into a giant vat of acid and finally turning him into the character as we know him, is not a part of the 2019 film, despite being the single most established part of the Joker's backstory. In fact, there's not even really a Batman, and instead we have something that at least starts as a relatively grounded story about an impoverished loner struggling with severe mental illness, placing us in a world where the evils of society emerge from cruel economic systems, lifetimes of exclusion and neglect, and not giant vats of acid.
Were it not but for a simple twist of fate, you yourself could have found yourself on the gallows today, good sir. And they're like, no, never. We're made of different moral fiber. It has nothing to do with our circumstances. We're stupid. We're stupid. I'm like, you don't get it.
This is Deconstruction, breaking down a story to ask the question, how would that actually work? And I think there's a special allure in doing this with a character most people already grew up with. After all, Joker is always the classic villain, getting in the way of pregnant Elsa and Spider-Man. Time goes on and relationships, finances, and the state of the world become real anxieties. And evidently this mix of nostalgic familiarity and real adult concerns is something that resonates with people. You may relate to this, or see it as a sad symptom of an infantilized mass culture. In that case, I recommend checking out Joker 2.
Couldn't believe that he based his whole life around this made-up story. Arthur wasn't funny at all.
Arthur Fleck differs from the comics in a way I think reflects these changing anxieties. Where before he was a family man trying to prove himself as a traditional male provider, Fleck is even more so the victim of a collapsing society, a bystander, alienated and alone, without purpose. He's an outsider in a way we can recognize, maybe even in ourselves. Maybe we are all the freaks. Maybe we are all the Jokers. And maybe there's something to say about how liberating it can feel to see these darker, shunned aspects of ourselves depicted in someone flamboyantly taking back control, even when taking back that control involves a lot of violence and pain inflicted not necessarily in the most productive ways. This is not a commentary on any current events. Or Carl Jung. And then the second movie comes along and says, oh, you felt that way? You felt a misguided sense of empathy and empowerment from this story? Well, fuck you, you get nothing.
Actually, I would say it's quite transparent that the writers and the director of this film didn't really want it to be enjoyed, especially by a particular group of people.
This is Anthony Fantano. Some call him the internet's busiest music nerd, but I call him the unbusiest brained stupid nerd. Because that's not what that director's quote says, Anthony. It says the opposite of that. Maybe if you weren't so busy, you'd have noticed. There's been effectively two major contentions with Joker 2. The basic one is that the film has a lot of musical sequences, and a lot of people didn't want to watch a musical, so they did not like it.
You don't know what happened.
It's a musical? Yes, sir. It's a full-on musical. La 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 and so on. You've heard of music. I have, yeah. I just don't know if I could successfully market a musical to comic book fans. Well, that's okay. Just mostly leave it out of marketing. It'll be a little surprise for people when they get to the theater. Yeah, that they will undoubtedly love.
I'll discuss this later. The more complicated side of it is the way the film almost maliciously dangles a version of the story they know a lot of the first movie's fans wanted to see, and then constantly denies it to them. Allow me to simulate the movie I think a lot of people envisioned. Arthur Fleck is in prison standing trial following the events of the first film. He meets Harley Quinn, his classic comic book love interest. Then through some series of events, they bust out of prison together and Fleck uses his newfound influence to establish himself in the criminal underworld. This naturally leads us to a story about the Joker's rise to the position we usually see him in other Batman media. Maybe along the way we get some kind of message about cult worship or how power corrupts. The important thing is at the end there's a pan out while Joker's sitting on some kind of throne and he does the Joker laugh, and maybe there's a cameo of another Batman villain. Let's say the Clock King. Just kidding, Killer Moth. How close was the film to what I just described? Well, there was another villain cameo. The actual story we get is one where the Joker is effectively made powerless in his own movie. Fleck's deteriorating physical and mental health leave him as basically a pawn in other people's games. A fetish object for Lee, this movie's take on Harley Quinn. Lee doesn't really care about Arthur. In fact, few of his fans do outside of his persona. Anytime it seems like we're gonna get some kind of explosive momentum in the direction of that more classic supervillain origin story, it almost always descends into just another musical fantasy. On two separate occasions, there's the palpable feeling that this is the moment the movie is actually going to move on from this. First in an escape attempt with Lee, and then with a breakout courtesy of two Joker fans ready and waiting to goon. Both times we are ripped right back to where we were before. Back and forth between a dreary cell and a depressing courtroom that is even then constantly trying to put more distance between Arthur and the Joker. Arthur's confinement ends up being reflective of the audience's confinement within this slow, small, sad story. Quiet, angsty smoking scene. Quiet, angsty smoking scene. Quiet, angsty smoking scene. So many quiet, angsty smoking scenes.
Oh, I can't do this anymore.
Then he fucking dies. This is an extremely obscure comparison, but when I was a kid, I was a big fan of the Rayman platformer games, and was very hyped when I got the new game Raving Rabbids for Christmas. And in that game, Rayman is locked in a coliseum and forced to play the same repetitive mini-games over and over again. And as I played them, I kept waiting for the part where Rayman would break out and then something more like the other games would actually start. Then when it seemed like I'd reached the point where Rayman was finally free, the credits scrolled and it turned out that was the end of the game. Joker 2 forced me to relive the worst moment of my life. Hey, I found a more enjoyable way to watch Joker 2. This joke doesn't even make sense because the visual element is one of the better parts of the film. You ever want to gaze into the abyss sometimes? I recommend a Manta sleep mask. I have trouble sleeping sometimes, so I have this ritual where every few months I remember that sleep masks kind of help, but also I've lost the one that I had before, so I get the cheapest one available, and it's okay, but it just sits uncomfortably on my face. And then when I open my eyes, I can still kind of see light poking in from the sides, so I just decide to throw it on a shelf somewhere, and the cycle begins anew. A few weeks ago, Manta Sleep sent me one of their Manta sound masks, complete with Bluetooth headphones, and it turns out when you have a good quality version of a sleep mask, it's actually way better. I still use it every single night, or actually Brit does, and I don't get to use it anymore.
Brit, can I have the mask?
I'm not exaggerating. Opening your eyes in one of these is like staring into nothingness. It's amazing. You should really come stare into the darkness with me by using the link in the description to get 10% off of your order. Do it. Do it for the Joker. And be sure not to miss their biggest sale of the year with the upcoming Black Friday to Cyber Monday sale. Thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. And thank you. There's maybe a more appropriate video game comparison I could make here. In 1998, Metal Gear Solid was released on the PlayStation 1 and became— yes, I'm making this comparison. In 1998, Metal Gear Solid was released on the PlayStation 1 and became a surprise smash hit, topping sales charts across the globe.
Revolver Ocelot has arrived!
The game told the story of Solid Snake, a grizzled Spec Ops agent who infiltrates a nuclear weapons facility to take down the rogue terrorist cell Foxhound. Expectations were high for a sequel that seemed to follow Solid Snake again on an extremely similar mission. Then the actual game came out. It turned out the marketing had been pretty clearly deceptive. Solid Snake was shoved to the sidelines, with the game instead focusing on an inexperienced twink named Raiden, with a story that seemed to collapse into a warped, uncanny meta-commentary of the last game with themes that, frankly, I still do not fully understand.
Believe in what? That's your problem.
Going even beyond misleading trailers, early reviewers had been explicitly told not to reveal this twist in reviews. At time of release, people were quite upset. To some extent, this is understandable. After all, Metal Gear Solid 2 is the worst Metal Gear Solid game. Opinions have warmed on it a lot over the years, and nowadays MGS2 has a legacy almost matching that of the first game, to the point where even joking about not liking it fills me with an intense feeling of dread. It remains to be seen if Joker 2 will have the same sort of critical turnaround. Metal Gear Solid creator Hideo Kojima seems to think so. But it's not hard to see the similarities in the initial release. Joker 2, similarly, was undeniably distorted in its marketing.
Let's get out of here.
The bit I did earlier wasn't just me poking fun at unrealistic fan expectations, it's basically the movie that was advertised. The few scenes that show Arthur Fleck outside of prison are stretched out to seem like a much more substantial part of it. The courtroom drama that takes up far more of the story is basically gone entirely. All else aside, there's certainly an argument to be made that consumers were wrongly misled. Let's argue about it. So you could say that in some ways audiences, especially of comic book movies, have become quite accustomed to misleading promotional material. Marvel movies will often just edit out or around major elements of the plot. What's the lizard jumping at? But I think in this case things go slightly deeper. Because besides this similarity in audience controversy, Joker 2 and Metal Gear Solid 2 are also united by themes and ideas that somewhat explain the way they misled fans. The game is in many ways about the breakdown of escapist fiction.
The digital society furthers human flaws and selectively rewards development of convenient half-truths. All this junk data, preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
A rogue AI predicts a world flooded with trivial content, a world where people are so overwhelmed with an unfiltered flow of misinformation and distraction that they ultimately resign themselves to constructed realities filled with comforting half-truths. No, this is not a commentary on any current events. And I always found it quite striking that this is all said in the context of a game that dupes players into thinking they're going to get a fun rerun of another game they like, then tears that away to give them something unexpected and unfamiliar.
So it was artificial on my end too. It was just a game.
I'd go even further and say that if Metal Gear Solid 2 was not advertised this way, this wouldn't have been nearly as emotionally effective. The antagonist isn't just messing with the main character, they're messing with the experience you paid for. It's not the hero's motivations that are being questioned, it's yours.
Another possibility is that self is a concept you conveniently borrowed under the logic that would endow you with some sense of strength.
That's crap!
Can the same be said about Joker 2? I would say, kind of. Video games and comic book media share a similarity in the way that occasionally they're recognized as legitimate art that can have their own things to say, but effectively for most people they're a casual distraction from the stresses of everyday life. Like YouTube videos. I'd say the frequent complaint, stop injecting politics into my escapist fantasy, largely comes from this disconnect. No, this is not... Joker 2 is also about this disconnect. It tricks viewers in, then refuses to be a continuation of the first movie's origin story. It refuses to lean into the classic ideas of the Joker character that many viewers felt they were being led into. Forced to face the reality of a situation, even Arthur Fleck refuses to be the Joker.
I can't be who you want me to be. It was all just a fantasy. There is no Joker. It's just me.
Arthur cannot escape, and this movie cannot be escapism. We don't get a straightforward rerun of tactical espionage action, and we don't get the explosive second act of a supervillain origin story. All of this annoys the Joker's fans within the film about as much as it annoyed audiences watching it. One question rules them all. Why the fuck was this movie called Joker?
I don't know why Todd didn't, I don't know why he called it the Joker. I don't know why he didn't call it like another name and have like Lady Gaga and Joaquin Phoenix doing a film. I think a lot of people would have gone and seen that. But this is like...
The second time Arthur gets a glimpse of freedom in the film, it's after a bomb is set off in the courthouse, leaving him the only one not incapacitated. This is a major plot hole because he was actually one of the closest people to the explosion. You're laughing. It was a major plot hole because it was one of the closest people to the explosion, and you're laughing. Here's a Two-Face origin story. So he's stumbling deliriously in the debris when he comes face to face with a mirror image of himself as Joker. The whole situation has a very dreamlike quality, especially since we've all been kind of waiting for exactly something like this to happen for the last hour and a half, Arthur included.
I just want to blow it all up.
Even he seems unsure on if this is just another delusion. But in the span of a few seconds, he's hurried into a car driven by another guy in a Joker mask, and they speed off while Billy Joel plays in the background. They're moving out, something he's been waiting for the longest time, feeling pressure but still heading uptown, girl. Until the news tunes in and the guys start ranting about how this is just the beginning and now they're going to burn the whole city down. Very much Dark Knight coded, especially given that Joker also escaped captivity in a very similar way. Arthur rejects this.
Wait, don't do this, man. Come on, man, get back inside.
This is not the beginning, this is the end. At this point, all he wants to do is find Lee and escape.
We can go. I escaped.
Except at this point, he's no longer the Joker. The fantasy is already over and Lee has no interest escaping with him. He already made the choice to accept reality and gave up the one thing that might have given him a way out. Figuratively and literally, there is no escape left. I feel this is the moment many viewers went from simply disliking this film to outright hating it. Let's discuss. So Arthur Fleck's Joker story is a denial not just of escape, but of escapism. This raises questions when the Joker has always been effectively the embodiment of escapism. Whether that's the Joker as a gangster abandoning all conventional morality or just a force of nature causing random mayhem, it's the one thing that unites basically every incarnation of the character. Even the concept is largely an escape from the baggage that might come from a villain with a more direct real-world context. Compare him to, say, Poison Ivy, typically depicted as a radical eco-terrorist who's so concerned about the environment that she cares more about plant lives than people. Or my personal favorite Batman villain, Anarchy.
Once the money's gone, we'll have a new system. Better one.
I only really know Anarchy from the Batman Arkham Origins game, and in that game he's a misguided teenager with a revolutionary political aesthetic who wants to expose corruption and help the underprivileged by setting up bombs around Gotham City and blowing up large civilian areas. So Batman punches him in the face.
Rebuild, Batman!
The Joker tends not to have this kind of overt ideological baggage. 10's not 2. 10. I think you can definitely look at his character, especially in the early comics, and see traces of fear around mid-century drug culture and psychedelics. His trademark weapon was Joker gas that sends people into an endless state of euphoric insanity and, you know, a giant vat of acid. Apparently the kind that being submerged in makes you lose all touch with reality and not die. I'm sorry to make such a what if the mushrooms in Mario were drugs adjacent point, but I feel like in this case it's an observation that makes sense. This is again something current adaptations often skip, but really it only adds to the point. Joker wants nothing more than to escape, and encourages everyone else to escape with him. All he wants is to laugh. It's what makes him such a perfect foil to his nemesis, Pregnant Elsa and Spider-Man. Batman is typically depicted with a no-kill rule because he doesn't think anyone is beyond saving. Often missed is how this also locks his character into his own eternal conflict. Can he ever really escape?
It's funny. This reminds me of a joke.
Joker 2, like the first movie, lacks a Batman. Some people have used this to dismiss these movies as a whole, feeling that the character needs this dynamic to properly function. Batman's typical role is to sober Joker up, force him back to a state of reality, return him to order and structure, usually in the form of a literal prison. But I don't think that's really the part of the story that often sticks with people, even if it's usually the whole point. See the endless drip feed of out-of-context Dark Knight quotes about how deep down everyone is just as self-gratifying and amoral as he is. That deep down nobody believes in anything. Meanwhile, the entire last act of the film is about how that isn't true. People are no less defined by kindness and altruism as they are by selfish greed. That's the film's explicit take.
What were you trying to prove? That deep down, everyone's as ugly as you. You're alone.
And I can't help feel like, in a way, that tells us something about how well the film expresses its ideas. If so many people came away with the feeling that maybe Joker is right, how good a job did it really do at selling people that message? It's a question of idealism. Can we really trust people not to give up, not to become the Joker? I still believe that first movie demonstrates that you don't really need a Batman to explore these ideas in a more complex way. Arthur is constantly filled with internal contradictions, and that's really never more transparent than when he goes full Joker. He pretends he has no real ideology and has no desire to represent anything, then immediately goes on a rant about his ideology. He complains about how comedy is subjective and people are too sensitive, when the entire catalyst for his breakdown is being the butt of a joke. He can barely even handle it when Murray Franklin adds his own punchline.
Knock, knock.
And you had to look that up?
He claims he's given up and nothing can hurt him anymore, then within seconds becomes overwhelmed with emotions at the audience rejecting his message. Even as he smiles and laughs at the response he's getting, he can barely conceal how angry and upset he really is. In truth, this is a man still desperately clinging to something, as in touch with his humanity as anyone else. In particular, the human desire to cope. This dynamic comes back as a central point of Joker 2.
Your defense is it was the Joker who did it. An insanity defense.
Okay, I don't know about our defense.
A lot of time in and out of the courtroom is spent arguing whether Arthur Fleck and the Joker are actually separate entities. A clumsy attempt to diagnose Fleck with a dissociative identity disorder, right down to the stereotype of him being taken over by a psychotic, evil alter ego. The case isn't convincing, and I don't think it was ever intended to be. Joaquin Phoenix is probably my favourite living actor, so I may be biased on this, but I think it's so clearly communicated in his performance that Arthur is always bubbling under the surface, even at his deepest levels of Joker delusion. In the end, he outright admits that this was all an act. In wrestling, this is called breaking kayfabe, essentially breaking character, and it's about as much of a betrayal there as it is here. In particular, to Lee. I've seen criticisms of Joker 2 that claim the movie effectively pushed the reset button on Arthur Fleck's development into the Joker. The top-rated review of the film on r/Joker reads, "It's made very obvious in the first movie that by the end he is Joker. Undoing the transformation is the worst thing with this sequel. The legacy of the first film will never be the same. Joker quotes won't be cool anymore." Except, again, that's not what happened in the first movie. There's always been constant reminders that the Joker is a thinly veiled performance, a false confidence, not a man who no longer cares, but desperately wants to appear that way. But much in the way people tend to forget the part where Batman comes in and contradicts the Joker, proves him wrong in some way, the messy truth to Arthur seems to get shaved away in people's memories. People remember the Joker dance and forget the bitterly sad scene immediately before where Joker's only friend cowers in the corner watching him senselessly butcher a co-worker right in front of him. This now also re-emerges in the courtroom. Arthur nearly breaks character already just hearing that Gary never saw his epic speech on the talk show.
Nobody thinks what it's like to be the other guy. You think men like Thomas Wayne ever think what it's like to be someone like me? To be somebody but themselves? They don't. They think that we'll just sit there and take it like good little boys. You didn't say anything I had to say. I can't believe it.
But that speech, the same speech that has become the most iconic and beloved scene from the entire first film, doesn't mean anything to Gary. He doesn't need to hear Arthur's rant about the plight of the other guy, the people abandoned by society, expected to suffer in silence like good little boys. Gary was the one forced to suffer in silence. He was the other guy that Arthur never considered.
I couldn't go back to work. I still can't sleep. And I'm scared all the time. I'm scared right now here. It's you in front of me. Do you know what that feels like, Arthur? You were the only one at work who never made fun of me. You were the only one who was nice to me.
And all he saw in the Joker was an embodiment of all the inhuman cruelty Arthur claimed to hate.
You finished? I mean, there's so much self-pity, Arthur.
You got a flair for the dramatic. You are tugging at my heartstrings, little Gary.
We also saw that reality. But do you think about that? Or do you think about the funny Joker dance, the inhumanity, or the standing ovation? There are a few times in that first film that some sleight of hand was used to trick the audience explicitly, giving the impression that Arthur had a real relationship with his neighbor and wasn't just stalking her. That wasn't the case here. All of that was already right there in that first film. Still, on some level, people want to see Joker break out of this. We want him to remain liberated, not be dragged down with pity or regret. We want him to ignore that reality, embrace that persona, and escape. The Joker as a character is a strange kind of wish fulfillment, but to a lot of people he pretty obviously is. He's not typically the kind of masculine power fantasy you see in a lot of comic book characters, especially on the heroic side. Since his creation, it's kind of always been the ultimate joke that the most beloved superhero's nemesis is just a guy who dresses up as a clown. Really, I kind of hate it whenever there's a version that even decides he's physically imposing. Except the Batman TV show one, where he's built like Donkey Kong. That one's pretty cool. But he makes sense as the ultimate villain because the wish fulfillment he offers is arguably the most dangerous one of all. To entirely give up. To give up on society, on community, on moral or ethical concerns, to the idea of caring about anything but our own hedonistic glee. Nowadays we call this doomerism. It is, again, a form of escape. It's a way of being we can easily dismiss as toxic and destructive, but it's also something I think all of us can feel. Sometimes it's something we feel all the time, especially when it seems like that society or community wants to reject us. There are few things more relatable than the idea of looking at the state of the world sometimes and saying, fuck this. But, this is a mind-blowing observation from me. The Joker is also a fiction. Let me clarify.
Self is just something used to preserve those positive emotions that you occasionally feel.
The character's role from the start was to be a reductive, kid-friendly nihilist, to equate perverse fatalism with a playground bully. For decades, his role was of a Saturday morning villain, the broadest possible caricature to be punched out by Batman week to week. This basic idea of the Joker as a persona that has seen the world for the sham that it is and willed themselves outside of it is necessarily incomplete. He's there so that Batman, representing justice and a sincere desire for vengeance on behalf of the victimized, can prove him wrong. Even as the character is developed into something more complicated and meaningful, there's always that underlying message. There is no escaping the consequences of your actions. There is no escaping society. you're in one. To go even further, as later adaptations have, you're already a product of one. You're as much a part of it as anyone else. It's worth noting that all the things I said about these internal contradictions in Arthur's Joker are also almost always there in most versions of the character. His boasts of rejecting order and ideology almost always give way to the truth that he does hold on to certain beliefs and motivations and would love to monologue to you about them. Famously, the man can't stand it when he isn't taken seriously. All the makeup and goofy suits in the world can't disguise the fact that this too is all an act. This man is invested. That's why the answer to the question, can he really escape, is usually no. He can't physically escape, but he also can't escape his own pride and ego. Chasing his own desires invariably leads him right back to his own neurosis, right back to himself, which leads to failure. This cycle of realization is completed by Batman. Or, in this case, Joker 2. So here's a little question Joker 2 poses. What is the real us? In The Dark Knight, the Joker claims that in their last moments, people show you who they really are.
So, in a way, I knew your friends better than you ever did.
In other words, people are defined by how they behave at their lowest and most desperate. But is that actually true? In moments of panic or trauma, people can act in impulsive, irrational ways. And even in the wake of it, their mind can be filled with cynical, negative thoughts. This is something Arthur tells us at the start of the first film. But if, in desperate times, we can act in ways we think are wrong, or we can think in ways we choose not to act on, how can either our thoughts or our actions fully define us? These are the kinds of questions we see in Minority Report, or Psychopaths, or even 1984. Speculative worlds where the law is enforced using thoughts of criminal behavior rather than crimes actually committed. By Joker 2, Arthur has amassed a whole following of people who identified with the thoughts he expressed on Murray Franklin's show. They also have grappled with these feelings of pent-up frustration and a desire to lash out at a hostile system. His speech and his actions that followed give them catharsis, an ancient Greek word that translates to cleansing. When a negative thought is cleansed, we can accept it as something that's part of us, not some dark other thing that needs to be locked deep down. This could be the catharsis that allows us to process grief or empowers us into action. That is what the Joker gave his fans.
The whole time I was watching, I kept thinking, I hope this guy blows his brains out. And then you did.
But just as much as we can cleanse a thought, we can reject it. Intrusive thoughts happen all the time. That is what Arthur does when he chooses to take responsibility for the violence he inflicted, the harm he caused both to the dead and the living. He says there is no Joker, and this is treated like a shocking moment. This is the point many viewers felt they'd been betrayed and misled. But the truth is, there's never been a Joker. Even the Joker isn't really the Joker. He's a concept, a passing thought, represented by a sad, angry man who simultaneously wants to reject society and also be recognized by it. The persona is a convenient way to disguise this contradiction. Joker is not a person, it's a verb. People become the Joker when they accept their most cynical and destructive thoughts as a part of them. This is to an extent natural, yet this character exists to demonstrate that this alone cannot make a complete person. Bursting at the seams is the man underneath, represented in these fleeting moments of musical romance. He wants to blow it all up in the same way everyone is capable of having those thoughts. All that separates him is his decision to make that his truth. So from all of this, there's a part of me that wants to say, no, this movie betrayed nobody. It completed the story it was telling and gave a more honest portrayal of this character than we were ever going to get from the self-assured, otherworldly versions we see in other adaptations. Not lacking in empathy or understanding, but filled with both of those things. Getting to the heart of the fact that the Joker is not a complete person. Because if you've been paying attention to these movies from the start, you always recognized Arthur Fleck as a deeply tragic character, a ticking time bomb set up by an indifferent society. All of this makes sense. This was never a hero's journey that was going to culminate in Arthur going full Joker, because the Joker has always been an illusion. He's not a cool, calculating badass who's unlocked the cheat code to societal liberation. He's a vulnerable, unstable man who takes all his past trauma and lashes out to inflict it on everyone else. The same amorphous concept that says people can be reduced to their worst moments because they have already embraced being the worst them. With the consideration that he is still a victim in his own way, that his actions were the result of a string of experiences he might have been spared from and not a simple chemical in his brain, it's a profoundly sad story. But it always was the story. And if you didn't think of it this way, and you did want to see a continued embrace of this escapist wish fulfillment, yeah, I understand why this movie would be a rude wake-up call. That's not the director telling you to go fuck yourself. That's not an attack on you. It's the conclusion to a tragedy that you just weren't seeing. The equivalent of getting mad because Scarface ends with the guy getting gunned down. If this film encourages you to reconsider how you felt before, that's a good thing. I think that was clearly the intention. And frankly, I can't think of a better time to break down the mythology of our escapism. To acknowledge that part that can lay dormant in all of us, that sees a broken world and has some idealized fantasy of what it would look like to burn it all down. To speak to that other side of us and say, no, it's not that I don't get what you're saying, it's that you haven't finished the thought. You lash out in a way that's not just contributing to the problems you see, but in many ways the reason for it to begin with. You're the one who just doesn't get it. Then there's the other part of me. And it wants to say, doesn't it feel like we've been here before? I think the people who've waited this long just to hear me shit on this movie deserve some catharsis. Deadpool is a lot like Joker when you think about it. Deadpool and Wolverine is another 2024 R-rated comic book movie about a controversial edgelord character that engages frequently in meta-commentary with its own audience. One major difference it has from Joker 2 is that people actually like Deadpool and Wolverine. Seemingly, both movies predicted this. Both films have a part where the main character looks at the audience and acknowledges whether they're having their expectations met. Except when Joker does it, he's complaining that they're not giving fans what they want, and when Deadpool does it, he's saying his epic fight with Wolverine is going to make the fans ejaculate into a sock.
Get your special sock out, nerds. It's gonna get good.
The movie is a string of in-jokes and fan service with a message that can be essentially boiled down to, it's good to care about things, which is kind of what Joker 2 is about. It also has several extended musical sequences, where iconic tracks play while Deadpool and Wolverine dance fight around the screen. No actual tension present because both characters are basically incapable of dying. There's a clear message in this comparison. This is what the people want, Hollywood. Give us Wesley Snipes. Why isn't there a part in Joker 2 where 87-year-old Jack Nicholson gets wheeled in and gives Joker a pep talk? Why doesn't Joker look at the prison guard and say, hey there, Mad Eye Moody, that's what the people want? There's an elephant in the room in talking about Joker 2 in that I tend to be quite powerless when we're talking about media in terms of the fun quality. My feeling has always been that fun is one of the most subjective categories, to the point where it's almost pointless to try and argue about. A lot of people actually enjoyed playing Metal Gear Solid 2. You can convince people something is cringe, but you can convince people anything is cringe. I sound like I'm saying Deadpool and Wolverine is cringe, but I actually found it very fun. And then sometimes I'll bump into someone who thought watching Deadpool and Wolverine made them want to die. And I say, well, that's fine, I guess. Not dying, you shouldn't do that. I personally find it a lot easier to talk about what a piece of media made me think about or how well I thought it expressed an idea. But undeniably, critical discussion of Joker 2 is drowned in takes that boil down to, yes, I understood the message, I simply hated the experience with every fiber of my being.
So you're saying it's not about us?
It is, but we're singing for them. That's why we're here, honey.
Oh.
And I feel terrible that those people had to listen to the last 20 minutes of this video. Again, I didn't have that great a time when I went to the cinema and saw it, and a big part of the reason I'm having increasingly positive feelings about it is because now I could Now I can just fast forward through the 30 minutes of the film that just feel completely unnecessary. Hey Todd Phillips, did we really need 2 duets in a row and then a third song 4 minutes later? I don't know, maybe those are your favorite parts of the film. I don't know what fun is. Hey Todd Phillips, cool self-aware commentary on the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. I love how Lady Gaga is the second lead in this fucking film and I felt basically no reason to talk in depth about her character until now. Because she has nothing to do the entire time. But it's okay because actually it's a commentary on how Arthur doesn't really care about the, in-depth of her character and just the romantic idea of her, which is similar to how she feels about him. Have you considered the fact that every Manic Pixie Dream Girl now is a self-aware commentary on Manic Pixie Dream Girls? I saw Scott Pilgrim and 500 Days of Summer and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. They came out like 15 years ago. Have you considered just having a complex female character? I'm sorry to woke cancel you for that. I thought War Dogs was fine. On the question of fun, my mind goes back to the Francois Truffaut quote about how there's no such thing as an anti-war movie. Something I don't think is strictly true, but often is. In a medium of visuals and sound, people are inevitably drawn towards engaging and dynamic stories. Those are the things that will often stick with them long after any subtle thematic ideas. It's pretty much self-evident why the Joker dance will have a longer lasting memory to people than the sad, understated murder scene right before it. So in a lot of ways, it's meaningless if a piece of media has all the right takes if it fails to engage the people it's actually trying to communicate with. I believe FD Signifier made a similar point in a video he released like an hour before I filmed this. Maybe that's not his whole point. I only watched a few minutes of it because it was frankly the idea of a better channel with a similar audience making a video on the same topic within a week of me putting together my own. Kind of makes me want to become the Joker. Hey, remember when these movies were about class? Characters in popular culture often stand the test of time because they can be boiled down to universal symbols that continue to mean something to people. Batman and the Joker are both relatively recent characters, but they too are often reduced to these symbols. Joker, as I've discussed, has become a kind of vague symbol of giving in to your own personal wants and abandoning all expectations of you by society. By contrast, I think Batman still resonates to a level beyond other comic book characters because he seems to take no joy in what he does. It goes back to a classic idea of noble self-sacrifice, duty and honor. He is, after all, a Dark Knight. But he's also, and this is such a tired observation that even Batman media is now constantly joking about it, a billionaire, someone who benefits tremendously from his society and has an obvious investment in seeing it not burn down. I will spare you my 18th segue into the growth of wealth inequality. But it's fair to say people nowadays tend to have a lot of criticism for the people who profit on their suffering. And this is something that has tended to hang over a lot of Batman media, especially over the last 10 years. Some of it has tried to sidestep this entirely. The recent Absolute Batman recasts him as a humble city engineer, and also now his bat symbol is an axe. Which, I mean, that's pretty cool. Batman 2022 dips its toes in saying maybe possibly the Wayne family could be well-intentioned but more complicated than they are often portrayed. Joker 2019 borderline makes seeing the Wayne family in other Batman media feel like 50s propaganda.
But the city's been suffering. People less fortunate than us have been enduring very hard times. So we built a new, cheap public transportation system.
Is that where you work?
No, I work at the hospital.
Bruce Wayne's father is depicted as callous and out of touch, fueling the fire that is eventually lit by Arthur Fleck's actions. Going even further, it's heavily suggested that Arthur is the product of an affair between Wayne and his mentally ill mother while she was an employee. The very first time Thomas Wayne appears on screen, it's to announce he's running for mayor due to the city's growing anti-rich sentiment, after which he refers to protesters as envious clowns who've made nothing of their lives. I can defend these films in many ways. Them being subtle is not one of them. Multiple times people are seen waving signs that literally just say, "Kill the rich" in block letters. Look, man, I don't like these films for the props, okay? There's such an obvious, overwhelming theme of class tension that runs directly into the Joker's rise in the public consciousness. His conflict with the Waynes is the cause of his breakdown, the motivation behind his grand speech. It also highlights his symbolic relationship with his fans. Of course we would reject society when the society is absolute arse. So what happened to the Waynes? Okay, I know that, but what happened to the signs? Someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but I searched around and the best I could find is at 1 minute 46 minutes in, there's a sort of half visible sign and I think it says resist on it. That's what you get. And what's up with all these crucifixes now? I fear God, not clowns? What the fuck is that? And where are all the super rats? The icing on the cake comes with the revelations about Lee, the only Joker fan depicted in the film with even the slightest crumb of characterization. She relates to Arthur, having come from a similar background of poverty and abuse, and this becomes the bedrock of their relationship. And then it turns out that she's actually a spoiled rich kid who lied about every problem in her life. And it turns out she just wants to burn shit down because... I get that it may have been even more exhausting for this film to have all its other issues and then also just be a retread of the same ideas as the first film. At a certain point, you want to move on. But of all the things to drop, the actual motivations of almost everything that happens is a really weird one to pick. I want to be clear that I'm not just mad in a kind of leftists want everything to be about class way, don't print in the papers that I'm mad. But so much of this story was already, again, about the impact of material conditions. Arthur Fleck did not do everything he did just because of some chemical imbalance. The assistance program he was a part of was shut down in the midst of cutbacks leading to the breakdown of public services throughout his city. The man was in poverty and needed help, and the response he got was constant physical and psychological abuse. It's integral to the tragedy of the character that he didn't just emerge out of the ether and commit these crimes. Rather, he is the scapegoat for the failures of every institution around him to do anything that could have helped. And, you know, that would have been nice to mention a bit, not just indirectly paint the people who are sympathetic to his message as spoiled rich brats who don't even know what they're mad about. My YouTube commenter senses are tingling while editing this part, so I did want to highlight one time in the early court scenes where Arthur's legal team does mention failures of the agency that was meant to protect him from his abuse.
Did you read the records from the Department of Social Services that show that when Arthur was 7 years old, they returned him to his abuser's home?
In context, this scene has less to do with addressing deeper systemic roots to Fleck's actions or the movement around him, and is more about justifying their split personality diagnosis. Like I say, I don't think this is a diagnosis of Fleck that the movie even tries to justify that much, and that kind of underlines the point I was making. If you want to bring up a moment like this to say the movie does address what I'm talking about, you should also acknowledge that it's relating to a completely different subject and is also one moment in a film that overwhelmingly backpedals from all of the class conflict that was so central to the first movie. I also acknowledge that I'm probably arguing with like 5 people watching this right now, and to be honest, mostly just with myself. I'm a flawed person. How about this? The Wall Street guys he killed were clearly harassing a lone woman on a train. Isn't it quite common for the wealthy to use legal threats as a way to silence victims of harassment, especially women? Admittedly cliche, but this would have been at least some kind of motivation for Lee's character. It feels like the movie is so laser focused on the question of Arthur's guilt that it forgets the complexities of the world he was a part of. If we're talking about the nature of choice, who we choose to be, I think it's relevant to keep going with the discussion of how much this is rooted in systemic problems. You can't criticize wish fulfillment without engaging with why the wishes are being made. So at first I felt like this was basically enough to discount every other valid message the movie had to offer. It's pretty much how I felt the whole time I was driving home after seeing it. But I wasn't mad, just to be clear. But as I've thought about it more, I think concluding on this would be missing something. What I just mentioned earlier was frustration on how Arthur was depicted as a scapegoat. I didn't feel like enough time was spent on the material reasons for his actions. Except There's always been an issue with his origin story that's stuck in my head since the first movie came out, and it was also about scapegoats. This story is also not material reality. Impoverished, mentally ill people are not typically the source of violence and disorder on a large scale. They are much more likely to be victims of those things and hurt themselves well before others. I think the choice to almost invert the class commentary of the second film is a conscious one. An attempt to redirect away from conflating people who want to stand up and protest their mistreatment in society with people who've given up on that society and just want to inflict pain and misery on others. The destructive impulse I've been talking about isn't isolated to people struggling with their material needs. This is a commentary on current events. Demographic data on the 2022 January 6th insurrection that saw rioters attempt to take control of the White House at the encouragement of Donald Trump.
We will never give up. We will never concede. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.
Reveals something interesting. Rioters actually came from a variety of employment and financial backgrounds. More than half were at a middle-class income level, with the highest proportion being business owners, while only 7% were identified as unemployed. Given that these events were placed almost exactly between the release of these two films, I think this change in perspective makes sense. Downplaying the more explicit class element of the story doesn't limit what it has to say, it widens it. It reveals that the issues we're talking about can't be easily limited by income or personal stability. Jokerification can take hold from any number of angles and anxieties. As I've said, people can often see what they want to see even when what they are shown contradicts those feelings. Once that feeling becomes who we are, it isn't that the media transforms our perspective transforms the media. And in turn, when the media clearly opposes that perspective, we're betrayed. Arthur Fleck's biggest problem, and the most significant message of his character, is that he is everyone, and he is also no one. He is an anomaly, not like everyone else, and that makes him a novelty to people. But it's also his curse when everyone starts projecting their own problems of the world onto him. Because the fact is, the problems people have with the world are many, and many of them are in total contradiction. We want to reject society, but we also want to benefit from it. We want the world to be cheap, but we want to be valued. We want meaning and distraction. So eventually I come to this conclusion that maybe, in a way, the things that make Joker a good or a bad series of movies are actually the same thing. And then I become the Joker. Last point. I think on some level, we're just done with deconstruction. It is often necessary to break down our long-held symbols and ideas for reasons this video hopefully highlights. But we're now living in the era of the boys, and the concept of gritty, grounded deconstructions of wholesome media is increasingly tired. We have heard the social commentary, we have seen the criticisms, we know the criticisms. We don't need to keep seeing evil Superman. What I see a craving for is a desire for hope. To not just deconstruct our classic stories down to the problems they represent, but reconstruct them in a way that gives us something new and positive to strive for. This is an extremely complicated topic that I don't think I can wrap up neatly here, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's another part of why Joker 2 saw so much backlash. Not strictly because of things done by the film itself, but by the timing of its release. All I really want to say is that the feeling I get is that we don't need another mountain to climb. There are mountains and hillsides enough to climb. There are oceans and rivers to cross. Enough to last till the end of time. Because what the world needs now is love, sweet love, because it's the only thing there's just too little of. I need to stop talking now. And yeah, I'm not. Hello. I just filmed the Man to Sleep ad, that's why there's a big red thing on my forehead. I've been editing this video for the past 2 weeks, please help me. There are 3 movies that I think are extremely connected to the Joker films in terms of the ideas I'm addressing, but I was kind of dumb while writing this video originally and forgot to include me really talking about them. The first 2 are Shock Twist, Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. The first Joker was unfavorably compared to both of them pretty frequently, and it's easy to see why if you didn't like that movie. Both tell the story of mentally ill loners like Arthur whose elaborate fantasy lives end up exploding into real-world crime and violence. In Taxi Driver, a target of one of these fantasies is a political candidate. In The King of Comedy, it's a beloved talk show host. Both are central figures in Joker. With that said, I do think there are things that obviously separate them from Joker. I always felt the perspective on The King of Comedy's Rupert Pupkin was pretty distinct from how we were shown Arthur Fleck.
Rita, every king needs a queen. I want you to be mine.
Pupkin feels more explicitly mocking from the start, and with the film's frequent breaks from his perspective, it creates a lot of distance that makes it easier for people to see him fully for the deluded person he's clearly portrayed as.
Jerry and I have a real relationship going, you know what I mean? No fantasy world, you know what I'm talking about?
I think that has its positives. Rupert Pupkin has definitely not been misunderstood as a symbol of righteous rebellion nearly as much as characters like Arthur. But without that level of intimate perspective, I think we still end up with a fundamentally different relationship from how many viewers felt towards Arthur Fleck. In many ways, it feels like a correction to Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, who very much feels like he's coming from the same vulnerable place as seen in Joker. But he also differs in his own way. In the shortest way possible, I think Travis Bickle yearns for the past in the way Arthur Fleck yearns for a future. They both suffer from clear signs of severe mental illness, but I find it hard not to see in Travis the feeling of a man lost out of his time. He's a veteran. He's a functioning adult, at least from a shallow outsider perspective. He dreams of being a cowboy. What separates him from the world more than anything is that he's failed to catch up with it. This reminds me of the changing anxieties I talked about between Joker and The Killing Joke, which frames its Joker's perspective as more based on trying and failing to be a traditional male provider. Arthur Fleck is unavoidably society's freak show, a punching bag, a reject from start to end. Take him back to the 50s and he'd already be in the asylum. Take Bickle back and he might just get the idyllic suburban family life he dreams of. At least it would look that way from the outside. That's part of the horror of it. And I think you can also see this in the ending, the thing I want to highlight from both films. On both occasions, these men enact their insane, violent plans, and society completely rewards them for it. Travis Bickle fantasizes about brutally gunning down criminals and being seen as a hero for doing so, and he is. Pupkin similarly enjoys one night as king of television after taking his idol hostage, and people are pretty into it. Even the legal consequences for their actions are far less severe than we see in Fleck, and I think that reflects the tension I'm talking about with audiences. Sometimes we only see what we want to see. Neither the content of an act nor its background motivations are strictly important, as long as they fit a narrative we've already decided on. It's what brings me back to whether the Joker movies succeeded or failed in what they were trying to say. Did it really matter if the first Joker movie had tried to be more clear in the criticism of Fleck and his actions, tried to make him look even more pathetic than the man constantly getting kicked around, mocked, and hit by cars? Couldn't all of this just continue to build up the underdog feeling of the character, especially if it feels increasingly like the movie itself is trying to go after him? Does Joker 2 undermining his actions in that way really do anything but embolden the people who've already decided to make him an icon? American Psycho is a movie that features two things. First, it stars one of the most iconic, memeable, sadistic killer protagonists in all of film history. If you've spent any time on the internet, you've probably seen this before. Or this. Or this. Patrick Bateman is a schizophrenic sociopath with dreams of murder and torture who hides his actions behind a cool, detached persona, and is also a deeply beloved character. So the second thing it has is an ending that undercuts all of this. Over time, Patrick's slick presentation starts to fall apart, and by the end of the film, he's a deranged, sweaty mess, bringing him to the moment he finally confesses all of his crimes to his lawyer. But it turns out, as Patrick reveals the truth of his dark, twisted mind, nobody cares. Maybe it was all just in his head, or more likely it did happen, but acknowledging that fact is an inconvenience most people around him just don't want to deal with. The real estate agent will cover up his killings to maintain property values. The lawyer will fabricate an alibi to avoid more questions being asked. Nobody cares about the demons deep down inside Patrick Bateman. Everything will be swept under the rug. Everything that happened, both in terms of Patrick's breakdown and his brutal actions, were meaningless. In the background background of a callous Reagan-era hyper-capitalist culture, there's an unsettling reality behind these events. So, as with the Joker movies, we're left with a divide. Fantasy and truth. Patrick and Joker both exist as fantasies for the characters and their fans, but those fantasies are disrupted by a lesson they were written to impart. Even if this lesson includes the meaninglessness of their actions, that itself has a meaning, but that doesn't mean we have to accept it. Fiction is a two-way communication. Any uncomfortable lessons can always be swept under the rug. There's always the choice to refuse. In other words, all of this can be enjoyed purely as an aesthetic. And if there's any conclusion I think making this video was underlined for me, it's that no piece of media can make that choice for a viewer. Certainly no mid-wit video essay can. All it can do is make that choice more apparent, or highlight that it's not really either or. There's nothing wrong with fantasy. There's nothing wrong with escapism. There's not even anything wrong with identifying with the Joker, who could be written in so many ways. This is the part where I talk about the People's Joker, if I had the ability to watch it yet. And as I've already said, I think this pattern of storytelling that only critiques and deconstructs everything into nothing without presenting an alternative is something people are increasingly fed up with. It reminds me of how people often use the Nietzsche quote about how if you gaze too long into the abyss stares back. To mean that obsession with the darker, hopeless parts of life can bring out a hopeless darkness in us. On the other hand, we could say that when we stare into the abyss and see the abyss staring back, we're recognizing something about ourselves in its reflection. That itself is a two-way communication, and what it might tell us is reliant on our willingness to stare back.
He's a prophet and a pusher, partly truth, partly fiction. Walking contradiction.
You saying that about me?
Yeah, so that was just a little thought I had while editing. Allow me to transition naturally back to the credits. Thank you for watching. This video was going to be a 15-minute long review. If you're interested in this thing I've been holding this whole time, I have a plushie that will soon be available at the link below. Please make sure to pick it up if you like the channel. It is a very good plushie, and also I get paid a lot more if a larger percentage of my audience buy one. I have big announcements to make soon. Until then, let me know what you think. Sometimes I do follow-up videos if I get a lot of opinions. Like the video, consider tipping via Patreon or Ko-fi to support the channel, and get on the credits scrolling now. And look, I'll say this about Joker 2. At least there's not a paedophile in the soundtrack this time. Honestly, I can't really relate to the idea of like a multicolored fool who's like nemesises with a knight. Just doesn't really make sense to me.
Jack, you're simply the best, and you got there all by yourself.